Hey everyone, Katherine from Katherine Urban Art, and I am really excited to be a part of the Pigeon Letters Summer Workshop Retreat. Thank you for being here. I have a wonderful little Beachtastic tutorial, how to paint this little painting. I hope you enjoy it. I thought I would go over my materials before we begin painting. The first thing I'm going to go over is I have a piece of watercolor paper. It is cold press. This piece measures 5.5 by 5.5 inches. Doesn't matter what size you have. My square for the painting that I'm going to do is 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. So cold press watercolor paper. I have a pencil that I drew my square on with, and I have a ruler that I drew that on with. So those are some of the items I used for this. I have washi tape. So there's 2 rolls of washi tape that I have. I used a couple different colors, one for the outside, one for the inside, which I will explain a little bit in my video, but that's my washi tape. I have a paint palette for mixing. I have my watercolor paints. So these are my watercolors. These are the colors that I have. I have a light yellow, which you could use a light yellow or white. I have just kind of a regular yellow. I have a yellow green, sap green. I have another green that's a darker green. And these are my blues. These get into my blue greens. If you don't have blue greens, you can always mix them. I have a really dark blue here. This is a gray blue. This is kind of a tan color, a dark brown, and a black. So those are my colors. You can use a regular set of watercolors. I just pull out the colors that I'm going to use from my set and set them aside. So that's my set of watercolors. And then I have my brushes that I'm going to use. I have a big mop brush. I have a round number 8 brush, and I have a round number 2 brush. And then I have a piece of terry cloth that I wipe my brushes off on, so I'm not going through paper towels. And then I have 2 containers of clear water. So as you can see, I've got water in there. One of the reasons I do this is because I use one water container to rinse my brush with. The other water container I use to wet my paints with. And by keeping 2 separate water containers, that keeps the one from getting muddy or dirty, so that when I'm adding water to my paint palette or my paints, it's clear water, and it keeps the paint colors true. So this is one of my biggest tips that I can tell you. If you're a watercolor artist, use 2 containers, one to rinse your brush with and a separate one to wet your paints with. And that's one of my biggest tips that I tell even my students when I am teaching school. So that's my set of supplies that I will use for this project. So let's get ready to paint. To begin, I am going to start by drawing my horizon. So I have a piece of cold press watercolor paper here. I have a 3.5 by 3.5 inch square drawn in pencil. The first step for my painting is to draw my horizon line. I don't want my horizon to fall dead center, so I'm going to measure up from the bottom about 1.5 inches, and I'm going to make a mark. So from this bottom line up 1.5 inches, from this bottom line up 1.5 inches, and then I am going to draw a line across to make my horizon. So that's my horizon. Next, I need to draw a line where the ocean and the sand meet. I am going to start over here on the left, and I'm going to end up on the right. And this side, it's going to be a little bit wider from the horizon. This is going to be a little more narrow. So I'm going to draw this. It can be a wiggly line, doesn't have to be straight. And it's going to end here to give me that perspective like the beach goes on. I don't always draw it in pencil, sometimes I do. But this time I'm going to draw it in pencil so that you can see that. I'm also going to add a palm tree. That palm tree will come here. So it's going to start here and come up this way, and the branches come down into that blue sky. I do that at the end in case I need to cover any mistakes in my sky. So I don't always draw my palm tree on there. I usually just paint that right on top after my background is done. This is all that I draw on my painting before I start and paint. Now I'm going to add my washi tape to my edges of my paper. This keeps my border clean so that paint doesn't get into those white borders that I like to keep on the edges. I'm going to add a piece to each side. Add one there. I have all 4 sides with washi tape. I'm going to press that tape in there pretty well so that that paint does not seep underneath the edge of that. And then I'm going to add more washi tape out here so that when I paint across, I don't get paint in those borders either. Now my washi tape has covered all 4 sides. I have one more piece I like to add. I like to add a piece right underneath the horizon line because I'm going to begin by painting my sky, and that'll leave me a nice crisp edge line for where my horizon is. So I put that down. I kind of usually peel up a little bit of this edge just so I can pull it off because it won't stay for the whole painting. Now it's time to paint the sky. I like to do just a graded wash of dark to light of a light blue sky for this painting so that that palm tree just pops against the sky. To paint the sky, I use a mop brush. So this is my mop brush. It's a very soft, very big brush. I like to use soft brushes for the sky so the blending doesn't leave too many streaks. There's my paint. I am going to use just kind of a cerulean type blue. So this blue right here is what I'm going to use for my sky. So I'm going to start by getting it wet. So I'm going to put my water in there, let that soak through. When I paint my sky, I usually use a brush that's very wet. So there's a lot of water on this brush. And because I do not wet my paper first for this type of sky. And then I'm going to use that very liquidy paint, soak it into my brush, and then I'm going to start to paint. I start at the top here and I work my way down. I do not add any more paint into my brush as I go down. When I do this, it gives me that graded wash where it's a nice dark sky at the top going to a lighter sky. Now there's a few places that the paint didn't fill in, so I can go back over it. And that brings a little bit more paint down. So if I want it a little bit darker, I really don't want it much darker, I can add just a little bit more up here and bring that color down. In fact, I'm going to rinse my brush out because it's really dark. So bring that down. Fill in that. Pick up a little bit of that paint off the bottom here. If I have a few streaks in my sky, I really don't mind it. It looks like distant clouds. So sometimes those streaks aren't bad. And a lot of the streaks will go away as it starts to dry. So that's my graded wash for my sky. One of the things you really want to watch for is overpainting. If you get to the point where you have paper that pills, you get a lot of little balls of paper across your painting, that means it's time to let it dry. So I'm going to leave my sky like that and let it dry. Couple tips. If you are using a heat gun to dry your painting, always press your tape back down. Heat guns tend to loosen tape, so you want to press it back down. I don't use a heat gun very often when I'm painting, only when I'm making videos. Now that this is dry, I'm going to take off this piece of washi tape where my horizon line is. I'm going to press everything back down again, make sure it's stuck real well after drying it. Take that off. My next step is to paint sand. So I'm going to bring this over here and we're going to come in and paint some sand. I am going to switch to a little bit smaller brush. This is my brush I'm going to switch to. It is, I believe, a size 8 round brush, and I'm going to mix up some sand color in my palette. So I like to use a tan. So I'm going to mix up a little bit of tan. And I like to use a pale yellow or white, whichever one. So I use a white that's a watercolor white, or I use a pale yellow, and mix those together to get that really light sand color. I like my sand to look really light, like it's a bright sunny beach day. So I'm going to start by putting my sand down here. And I'm going to take it right up to that line and past it even a little bit where my water is. So my sand is coming in here. One of the things I try to do is to paint across the tape into my painting instead of from the painting out to my tape. That helps keep it from bleeding underneath quite as bad. So if your sand is a little bit light or you want a little bit more interest in it, sometimes I will come in and add a little bit more of that brown in there, like that. And sometimes I'll even take the straight up tan color and add it right along here so it gives it ocean a little bit of depth. And then I will come back to the sand a little bit more after it's dry and I've done a few other things. So I'm going to dry that, and then we're going to move on to painting the ocean part. I'm now going to start adding some color to the ocean. I am going to use kind of a aqua blue color, this one right here, for the base of my ocean. So I'm going to put this in here. You can kind of see what it looks like. And I am going to paint most of this triangle with this aqua blue color. I'm going to leave a little bit at the edge white. So I'm going to freehand along the horizon here. I'm not going to worry if I get up too close to it because I am going to add a little bit darker blue up there. You can actually, if you want waves to look like they're rolling in and you leave some little white spaces, that'll look like waves rolling in, or you can make it a calm looking beach. But along this edge, I'm going to leave a little bit of white for the sea foam. That gives you kind of an idea where the sea foam is going to go. So I'm going to just paint all that in. I'm not going to leave mine with the white caps on the ocean. I'm going to paint it out. Just leave it a calmer ocean for this picture. So that's where my ocean's going to be. I'm going to come in and put a few diagonal lines in there, and that'll start to give that effect of waves coming in. Down here, this can be all a darker blue. Then I'm going to add a little bit of this dark, dark, dark blue. It's a very, very dark blue. Let's turn that so you can see it. And that's going to go right against my horizon line to give some depth to my ocean, to push it back. And I don't mind that it bleeds down into my water, my aqua blue water. I just don't want it bleeding up into my sky. So that pushes my ocean back. Anytime you're doing an ocean painting or a landscape painting, you want that dark line against the horizon to really push your painting back. And then I'm going to add what's on my brush, a couple little lines like this to give that ocean some waves. I'm going to dry this and then go on to the next step. Alright, I'm going to come back in and add a little bit more detail to my ocean. I have got a smaller brush. I love this little brush. It's a little round number 2 pigeon letters brush. I use it all the time. In fact, the 3 brushes I am using in this video are my 3 favorite brushes to use. So I'm just going to kind of darken this in just a little bit. I'm using this. I like my sea to have some ripples in it, especially when it's small like this. So I come in here and just kind of add little ripples, little lines to look like ripples to my ocean, just to kind of make the waves look like they're rolling in. So as long as you have the dark line against the back, I'm going to probably darken that just a little bit more. I feel like it could be just a little darker. And then some dashes in through here to make it look like waves. Then it starts to show depth and looks like the ocean. A little bit darker there, and I'm going to blend it out just a little bit more with that aqua blue to give it that depth, like it's far, far away. A few more lines of that darker blue in here so it all goes together. And the lighter spots start to look like the sea foam, and the darker spots are the shadows underneath those waves. So that is my ocean. The next step, I'm going to add some sea foam across the ocean where my sea and sand meet. To do this, I'm going to use my little brush, and I'm going to use something called Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. This is a very opaque white, unlike watercolor that is transparent. So this white is very thick, it's very opaque. When I open the jar and you look at it, sometimes you need to add water to it because it is really some thick stuff. So I will a lot of times put it into my paint palette over here. You can water it down. The more water you add, the more transparent it becomes. But for this, because I want it to come on top of this and look like sea foam, I don't want to water it down. I want to keep it pretty thick so it starts to look like that foam on the ocean. As the foam gets farther back, you won't see as much of it, so I try to keep that pretty small back in here at this end. But down here you'll see more of it, so this part I like to have it a little bit wider. Now this foam I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because it's so small. It's off in the distance a little bit, so I'm not going to do as much as I normally do for sea foam on this. I'm just adding a little bit across the page like that. I need to let that dry, and then I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow underneath for the next step. Now that my seafoam is dry, I'm going to add a little shadow underneath it to give it some depth. So I'm going to go back to my tan. I want this to be a little darker than my beach color, my sand color. So I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to add a shadow all the way underneath this by just adding a little bit of a line. So just a little line underneath. That makes the sand look wet, gives it a little shadow to that to give it a little depth. I'm going to add a little bit more dark to it by going a little darker with this brown. I'm going to mix a little bit of that in there. Give it a little bit more dark area underneath. Just a thin little line right in here to really give that a little tiny bit of depth, especially down here at the left side where it's a little closer. That'll give your beach just a little bit of depth to it. You can make this line that's the tan line a little bigger if you want it to look like the waves have come up on the beach and the beach is still wet in places. So sometimes I'll do that too. I am ready to start my palm tree, and I'm going to put my palm tree over here a little bit on the right, angled up this way. And to do that, I start just by drawing the trunk in. So I will get a little bit of the dark brown and mix it with the tan. I don't want my palm tree trunk to be too dark, so I kind of mix those together. And then I draw the palm tree trunk. And the nice thing about the tree trunk is it doesn't have to be perfect. None of them are perfect. One of the reasons I love to draw trees. I just kind of angle it in here. So I start with a line, and then I take my line and add more to it. So over here, I add a little more, and I have it get thicker as it comes towards the bottom. So my tree trunk needs to look thicker as it comes down towards the bottom down here. And then once I have it where I kind of like it, the bottom of my tree trunk I need to round. So make sure you have that as a oval or a kind of rounded bottom. So if it doesn't work, add more to it. Doesn't hurt. Palm trees aren't perfect. And then I come in here and fill in. I'm going to do this right on top of my background. You do want to make sure your background is dry before you do this. And then I usually will do a little bit of this at the top, kind of make it a little fuzzy before my branches come out. And then I like to take my palm tree and add a little bit of scoop this over. So I have room, a little bit of a dark edge. So I add a little bit of black over here to make it look 3D, so it's not quite so flat looking. So I add a dark edge there. And then I come back to my white, bleed-proof white. I'll move that back again. And I add a little bit of a white edge here. Like that. And then I come back in with my brown and blend those two together. A lot of times I blend across like this so it gets that palm tree texture. So I'll kind of blend across like this and then come back down. And again, doesn't matter the shape of this. And if you get too dark, add more white in. So up here I'm going to add a little bit more white and it'll start to blend into that palm tree color. So there is my palm tree trunk. Okay, for my branches on my palm tree, I like to use yellow and draw the center of the branches first. So for this, I'm going to come in, draw right on top, like this, where my branches are going to go. So there. Have one come over this way. And you can put as many branches as you want in this. I think I'm going to start with that and I may fill in. So once I have the yellow in, I go to a kind of a yellowy green color. I can move that down where you can see that. I'll turn this around. So this is my yellowy green color. I like to start my palm tree with that. So I get that. And I use a small brush for this, sometimes even smaller than this one. And I bring from that yellow line, it's kind of a sap green color, I bring that down from that yellow line. A lot of palm tree branches have a yellow middle to their line, and that's why I do that. Then I bring these down, just little bitty short lines, always coming down towards the ground. You don't want your brush too wet for this, or your branches will become one big blob. So you kind of want it a little bit dry. Feel like I could probably use another good branch in there, a couple branches probably. Go back to my yellow, add another one up here. And then I like to come in with a little bit darker green in some of the areas too. So I will pick up a darker green and kind of make it a little darker closer into that palm tree, getting lighter as it comes out. Always on that underside. And then I'm going to add a little bit of black in here just to give that a little bit more interest. And just a little bit of black in some of these areas to separate my leaves. And that's my palm tree. My ocean, my palm tree, my beach is done, but they look a little bit separate. One of the things I like to do is add a shadow in on the sand from my palm tree. That kind of grounds my palm tree a little bit. Turn this around. So I'm going to come back to the sand color. I can darken a little bit if I want. And I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow. I'm just going to take it right off the edge of the paper. Little cast shadow in there gives that tree, just makes it feel like it's part of the painting now, not just stuck on top. So I have a little shadow. It's a little bit narrower where it is close to the palm tree, gets a little wider as it gets away. Another thing I like to do for the sand is put a little bit more shading in areas just to give it a little more depth. So like up here, I might have it a little bit darker. Even down here by the ocean, if I want it darker, I can come in and do that. Just a little bit so it looks like it's not perfectly smooth. Kind of makes it tie together a little bit more. A little bit back there, darker back there, farther away. Just to give it a little more interest. Then I'm going to let it dry and do my final step. Alright, the last part I like to do, you could easily leave this painting like this, but I'm going to add a little bit of grass to the edges of my painting, just to tie in that green since that's the only green in the whole painting. So I like to come in with a little brush, pretty dry, I don't want it real wet, and add little pieces of grass in around. You could even add some around the edges of your palm tree if you wanted, wherever you like to do that. So like I said, you want a pretty dry brush because you don't want it to bleed all over the place. So in here, gonna add a little bit. Just something to kind of frame the edge of this a little bit. You can add it all the way across the front or in the edges if you like, whatever it is you want to do. I'm gonna add a little bit in the middle. You could turn them into some of the sea oats even. Sometimes I do that. I like to give mine depth, so I try to go a little bit darker. If I get it too dark, sometimes I'll come back in with a little bit of white just to lighten it, just to give it some depth. So now my grass has that different colors, shades of green, give it a little more depth. Just to give it something to kind of tie in so the beach is not just quite so plain. And now the painting is finished. The next step is taking off the washi tape. So I'm going to move my palette and paints out of the way. And I am going to start to carefully peel my washi tape off of this. This for me is the most satisfying part of the whole painting process. You want to take this slow. You want to take it at an angle so that it doesn't tear your paper or your painting. So I'm going to start by those outside pieces I put on first. Alright, so those are the outside pieces. They're a little easier. Now for those inside pieces. For these, you really want to go slow. You always want to pull away from your picture. Make this one's on top. So as I do this, I want to pull away from my painting. I don't want to pull my tape this way into the painting. It could rip my paper into the painting. This way, if my paper rips, it's ripping away from the painting and I can still save the painting. So I'm going to go very slow. Notice my tape is at a very extreme angle as I pull this off. There's the first one. the second one. Here's my third one. And my last piece. And all that's left to do is to sign it, and it is done. Thank you for following along. I would love to see any art you create from this tutorial. Please tag me on Instagram at Katherine Urban Art.